But gee, I thought the Sumerians were speaking the only and original Semitic language because it was the Lashawan Kadash, or the original tongue Adam spake. Today's date is November 4, 2017. This lesson is titled Non-Semitic Languages. Alright, so dealing with the search for the Hebrew, the real Hebrew language, or just the real language period that the people in the Bible started out speaking and ended up speaking by the time the Old Testament was done with, then I'm wondering about the non-Semitic languages, how they fit in, because, trying to look at different Semitic languages, you just can't really rule out the non-Semitic languages, because, like I've said before, the people that the Most High is dealing with speaking their so-called Semitic or Shemitic language, they can automatically speak the non-Semitic languages as well, even if it's by using some excuse of language called lingua franca. And sometimes the lingua franca as an explanation just doesn't fit some places. But I'm looking at this article here that's dealing with some stuff that happened in Genesis chapter 11 with the Tower of Babel. With looking into a topic like this with the Hebrew language and Babel and so on, of course, you will come across, and I've read his stuff for a while now, but I wanted to take a look at this article he did for G, and the rest of it goes on. So it starts out saying Hebrew is classified as a Semitic or Shemitic from Shem, the son of Noah, language. It's classified as a Shemitic language. Was Hebrew just one of the many Semitic languages, such as Canaanite, Aramaic, Phoenician, Akkadian, etc., that evolved out of a more ancient unknown language? Or was Hebrew and the Semitic family of languages the original language? Now, when I read from Genesis chapter 11 and verse 1 and 2, it says here, and the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. And I've always thought what people said, that everybody was speaking the same thing. But sometimes I wonder. But anyway, verse 2, and it came to pass as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. And then verse 3, they said, go to, let us make us brick. So you would then assume that they were saying go to in one language that they were all speaking. Now, does Genesis 11 and verse 1 mean that the whole earth had only one language, knew only one language? Or are we to understand that if they were journeying, as it says in verse 2, from the east, that they were just using a main language, an agreed upon language? A language that helped to identify them in this particular way as being, one people. And so now, since they're moving and traveling together and probably staying by themselves, and obviously it's showing in this chapter 11, that they were trying to find a spot for themselves, so they're not living among other people, then they could be just traveling with their own language. So if they had other languages when they were dealing with other people elsewhere, they don't need that anymore. They're not using those languages anymore, I should say. They're just using the language that they're more known for. that's more known among them, that's more common among them. So we've always thought, if the whole earth was of one language and one speech, that everybody was speaking that one language and that it was the language from Adam's time that Adam knew. But of course, as I've cussed out chapter 10 on past videos, chapter 10 presents a problem to the way that people's minds should function when they're dealing with quote-unquote God. If he created the world with Torah, with wisdom, and breathed this Torah life of wisdom and so on in Adam, so then if man was created like that, and creation is built in an orderly fashion, even the account of it in Genesis chapter 1 tells you there is some structure that covered over how everything was done. Everything under this name of day 1 was done on day 1, everything under day 2 was done on day 2, and so on. So there was some order there. It looks like, very wise, smart moves, and it's very ordered. But as soon as I get up to chapter 10 and 11, some kind of order is broken. So the days were numbered in creation, but the people writing about the same creator in his book that they said he gave, these 5 or so books of Torah, all of a sudden they break order and present it to you in a manner that breeds confusion in your mind. So who is the smart person of the Torah who is writing himself or dictating the Torah to somebody else to write? Is it Moses, the wise man who met with the God of wisdom on Mount Sinai? Or is it someone else who later flipped around some words and sentences and so on, and then later on in our time brought them up in chapters for us and said, let's put this here, let's put this there? Because chapter 10, if we're dealing with chronology, does not fit properly, as chapter 10 talks about many languages on the earth, but chapter 11 that comes later on is telling you that the whole earth was of one language. So something would have happened after chapter 10 and by the time chapter 11 speaks to have brought some catastrophe or some unity on the earth where people dropped off their many chapter 10 languages and started using only one language. Chapter 11 also paints the picture that everybody on the earth was traveling from the east, and you would assume that they're traveling west, right? In the Mesopotamian area, you would assume that because, you would guess that if they were going north or so, they would have probably mentioned that. But to say from the east and just leave it like that, I guess they're assuming that the reader will understand that they were moving from east to west. But if it's not that, and nothing happened to destroy chapter 10's many languages of the different nations, or remove those languages so that they only have only one in chapter 11, then someone placed chapter 10 before chapter 11 for what can seem to me to be either being unskilled in how to jot down the Torah, or they had some benefit that they would get from putting chapter 10 before. That benefit to me would only be deception. I know, okay, there he goes again. Well, you read it and feel what you feel. That's how I see it. Because the amount of confusion that rises from this and the language problem that people are searching the world over today, and the world is soon to end, like some people say, and we still can't figure this in a book of wisdom, and you're telling me this is not a problem to have it written like this? How can the wise Torah be like this? It was necessary to present an orderly presentation of what happened from chapter 1 in Genesis, and then you just switch and just feel like, I'm just going to confuse people. I'm just going to jumble this up and put it everywhere so that and you tell me, oh, it's because it's Eastern writings. You got to read from page 2 and then jump to page 15, then go back to page 3 and then jump over to page 35 and then jump to page 200 and then come back to page 8 and so on. Listen, this is supposed to be straightforward history right here at this point. You're mentioning many language in chapter 10. And then you go to, after people are in very different places on the earth. And then you come to chapter 11 and tell me now that they were just journeying to one place altogether with only one language, when they were already dispersed in chapter 10 that happened before. That doesn't sound smart to me. You see, because someone tells you this is the Torah, this is the book of God, you don't have enough common sense. You just have faith. And so you have to believe, like I was told, this is really how it happened, or this is why it was written like this, and there's a good reason. It might have been how it was written, but there's not a good reason for it. Now, might it have been a strategic reason for a particular reason? Yes, but that doesn't necessarily mean it was a good reason. Good for somebody else. It's not good for me. Because I got to read too many books to figure out the one book that is supposed to be the manual of life. And I'm still left guessing. Now, can you imagine if time goes on some more and instead of cars, now we're owning our own spacecrafts? And you're trying to go someplace in deep space that doesn't exist, and something goes wrong and you're supposed to just make one simple thing like, okay, something happens, you got to press some emergency space brakes to stop. And you cannot figure out where the emergency brakes is to be found, where it's located, because they didn't put it where it was normally put in a car, right where you can quickly reach it and so on and see it. And you have to go and read the manual with many pages in it to figure out how to stop before you crash into that asteroid. So the manual of life is going to help you to figure out what life is all about, what the Creator wants, how you should live, blah, blah, blah. And you can't figure it out, even though millions of expert Hebrew scholars have lived and died on the earth, and more commentaries are still being written. And this is the book of God. So the article goes on here, the second paragraph in his writing. According to the Bible, all people spoke one language, as in Genesis 11 verse 1, which I just read, until the construction of the Tower of Babel in southern Mesopotamia, which occurred sometime around 4000 BC. And he gives his sources. During the construction of the tower, God confused the language of men and scattered the nations, and you'll find it in Genesis 11, verse 7 to 8. So, his sources, like from Merrill F. Unger's Bible Dictionary, say this Tower of Babel stuff went on about 4000 BC. You read somebody else, will tell you about 2200 BC. You'll read somebody else, tell you something else. What it seems to me, though, is that a whole lot more time happened, a whole lot of time passed between these chapters. Like they say, between Noah's flood and the Tower of Babel was probably somewhere about 340 or 350 years, somewhere there. So it seemed to me, though, like a whole lot more development happened. And when you look at people giving different dates about when man was created and when these different things happened in the first, let's say, 10 chapters of Genesis, it seems like a whole lot more time had passed on the earth. And so different dates are given as people look at it from different angles and see different things. And so you can see why I'm saying somebody at some point is trying to hide something. That is my personal feeling. Because with the hiding of time, which will couple itself with the hiding of the language, one will then not learn of the real language, original language, too easily, without a lot of, searching and so on. But you will also not find out easily who was really doing what in all those times when we're dealing with messed up dates. And all these dates that many, many books are giving, it's like you can just be in a circus just juggling dates like balls, like that, and just, blah, 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 blah. Because the dates are just out there, like left, right, and center. This date, that date, this date, that date. This much time had passed, this much time has passed. So if you are hiding time or removing time, you are hiding more things, more events. And events are linked to people. So then the people in the scriptures are being hidden. That means we know less of the history of the people because more of their years have been removed or hidden or jumbled up. So people will give some fancy calculations and tell how there could be anywhere from probably 40 or 50,000 people up to close to 1 million people on the earth between when Noah came off the boat with his family members and the time of Babel. Some people say it's only a couple hundred years. Some people are thinking maybe 1,000 or 2,000 years, could have passed. So if it's on the higher side, the numbers, then a lot more things could have happened. People would have spread out some more. Now, let's run over here to chapter 9 of Genesis and verse 1. And Elohim blessed Noah and his sons and said unto them, Be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. So somebody might have told you that the people were cursed at Sumer with the Tower of Babel, with their language, they were cursed, but the people of Shem, or the people dealing with the Most High and so on, was their language was not cursed, so they kept the original language. But other people, I guess it would mean from Ham and Japheth, their languages were cursed. But I already showed you in a recent video that Shem ended up having, in his descendants, many languages. So if multiple languages equates to a curse or have its root in a curse, if that is correct, then why are the wise people of Shem trying to speak many languages, as in Genesis chapter 10, to participate in a curse that they did not receive? So you see other people moving around the earth with different languages because they are cursed in their mouth, and you go and you practice the curse by speaking many languages, many Shemitic languages. And so we've come to the place where we have somehow been cultured in our mind to think that because there is a term Shemitic languages, somehow it makes it better, as if there's something righteous about that, when multiple languages are shown in chapter 11 to be the result of curses or a curse from the Creator. That's what they want you to think. But it could be the case. But I don't know if there were many trees made, if there were many animals made, many everything and whatever, why can't we speak many languages? I don't know, maybe that's just the wrong way to think. Like I said to you, the first video on the Hebrew language search last year, not an expert at this stuff. And my brain works funny compared to the rest of you who read the Torah, so that's just, But I noticed, though, that if I go on in chapter 9, that something interesting jumps out at me here. That every time we see the Most High making a covenant with people, we say it is a good thing. And so we talk about the covenant with the Shemites and the covenant with Abraham and so on, and covenant, and oh, it's nice. Word covenant, when you see that, it's just like your spiritual antenna just extends some more, you're more connected to God. But he makes a covenant here with the other people in chapter 9, who are the children of Noah. So we look at it now saying, okay, if Shem's people retained their language because their tongue was not cursed, but the tongue of Ham was cursed and the tongue of Japheth was cursed, they were kind of setting Shem aside. But if we go now in chapter 9, down a little bit more, let's see, jump down to verse 8. Genesis 9, verse 8. And Elohim spake unto Noah and to his sons with him, saying. So he is now making a covenant with Noah and his sons. And I would imagine by saying sons, he's including everybody on the boat. Because sons there to me would mean their whole house, which is just their wives. But then they're going to have children and so on. So it's like to the house. So like you see, the house of Israel, for example. So this would be now the house of Ham, the house of Japheth, and so on. So when you look at these non-Semitic peoples now, and you talk about Ham and Japheth, and you want to curse them in scripture and feel bad about them and put them down and so on, they came off the boat with fresh new life, covenant life from the Creator, all peoples on the earth. That means Shem, Ham, Japheth, and their father. Because, and Elohim spake unto Noah and to his sons with him, saying, verse 9, and behold, I establish my covenant with you and with your seed after you. And then he goes on to explain the covenant. Now, I won't get into that. But, he repeats the word covenant again in verse 11. Right? So the Most High is dealing with them all. So if he's making a covenant, he's making a covenant for good things now, for blessing and so on. So he's telling them how to live. In verse 17, and Elohim said unto Noah, this is a token of the covenant which I have established between me and all flesh that is upon the earth. So, alright, I had to break the recording. My recorder died, so I'm just jumping back in wherever I think I can, whatever I was trying to say, if I remember it. But I'm in Genesis chapter 9. And so he established a covenant now with everyone in the earth. So by the time they've journeyed in chapter 11, verse 2, from the east, and when you look at verse 1, saying that they're of one language, it seems to me that that would more be sooner after they come out from the boat, from the flood. Because chapter 10 coming deceptively before chapter 11 is showing you many, many people in different parts of the earth with their many languages, so different nations. So chapter 11 verse 1 and 2 sounds closer to coming off the boat when they still had one tongue. But then, after the tongues got split, then they were dispersed all over the earth, and then chapter 10 happened. So chapter 11 really should be called chapter 10. Chapter 10 should be called chapter 11. That's how I am thinking of it. But he has established his covenant with all flesh on the earth. And verse 19, these are the three sons of Noah, and of them was the whole earth overspread. So chapter 11, they were of one speech closer to the time when they came off the boat, and they were still more together. And they journeyed now, and then they found a place when they journeyed from the east. And then they were overspread, as in Genesis 9:19, overspread over the whole earth. And then the many languages are shown in chapter 10, after the dispersion and the tongues problem in chapter 11 happened. So it looks like somebody in chapter 9 knows that the whole earth was overspread, so they're writing this from later on looking back. So they know the order in which things happened. So if they're just casually mentioning here in chapter 9 in verse 19, the whole earth was overspread by them, okay, the placement of that, you can kind of go along with that. You can understand that they're looking back and just telling you, we know now by this time of writing it that the whole earth was overspread with them. But chapter 10 is attempting to give somewhat of a detailed breakdown of chapter 9 verse 19. So at that point, if you're giving all those details, you should have put that after chapter 11, because details are supposed to offer some correct kind of view. So if you're trying to get people to see correctly what happened, and you say in chapter 9 verse 19 that the whole earth was overspread, then you should go on to then saying after chapter 9, they were of one speech, and you should basically saying this is how chapter 9 verse 19 happened, where they became overspread, is that they were all of one speech and they journeyed from the east to Shinar, and then whatever happened with Babel happened and they got cursed, and then they got dispersed and spread over the earth and started using many languages. That would have made sense, because there's no hiding of information there's no confusion and so on. And that way, quote-unquote, religious deception is resisted in the whole earth, because you are now limited in the amount of views you can have with a straightforward story that comes out of the wisdom writing of the record of Torah. And then verse 20 here in chapter 9 says, Noah began to be an husbandman and he planted the vineyard. So Noah starts to busy himself with life. He's getting back to life as normal now. He's doing stuff. So you can just imagine that the sons and the wives would have been doing the same as well, doing their work, whatever they're doing, and having children. So life is starting to get back to normal now. If we go down to the end of chapter 9, not quite the end, where is it? No, sorry, it's not the end. It's verse 18. Chapter 9, verse 18. And the sons of Noah that went forth of the ark. So the covenant is being made before they get out of the ark. So they're still on the ark, I would think. And they went forth of the ark. And they that went forth of the ark were Shem and Ham and Japheth. And Ham is the father of Canaan. So they went forth of the ark with a covenant, all three of them. So these people have a covenant to enjoy the earth and, be powerful on the earth, and have dominion in the earth and so on and so forth. But they're supposed to live properly on the earth, according to whatever is laid out in the covenant in chapter 9. So these people are all covenant people. Not just Shem. Ham is a covenant people. Japheth is a covenant people. But somehow the book strangely continues to develop by showing you that it seems like it's Shem that's really got the covenant. Now if I get back to the article, third paragraph, it is at this time that the Sumerians from the land of Sumer, known as Shinar in the Bible in Genesis 10 and verse 10, speaking a non-Semitic language. Now, that's why I decided to make this recording. So just to show you my thoughts, how confusing this Torah is. And listen, You can cuss me and tell me I don't have any respect for the Torah. It is confusing. We have been taught to be so religious that we must just have faith, and we must just believe everything that we're taught. People are thinking less of themselves now, more and more, about the Bible. If you find the book to be confusing, why is it dishonest of me to say that? Am I cursing the Creator because this is just my feelings in my heart? Well, most I know is I'm searching for wisdom as to what is written in the Torah. So I'm just straight up honest. It is a confusing book. I've been reading this thing from when I was a small child, although back then I read more the New Testament, but I still read from the Old Testament, and it's still confusing to this day. Although I'm learning more and more, but it is just confusing. So they come now in Genesis chapter 10 and verse 10. Let's see what that one says. Verse 10, and the beginning of his kingdom was Babel and Erech and Akkad and Calneh in the land of Shinar. Okay. And they're speaking, these Sumerians from Shinar, a non-Semitic language. Now let's run back to chapter 11 and verse 1. And the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. So then, am I to understand that the whole earth was just Sumerians, or people who became Sumerians? So if people were different places, then they joined together with their one speech, and they traveled to say, let's go live instead of separate places, let's go live in one place. Let's travel from here, there, and everywhere, and go to find one spot of ground, which we call Shinar, and let us stay together, and we have one speech. So all of these people have one speech. So Shem, Ham, and Japheth come off the boat with a covenant. And they came off the boat speaking one language. Because I don't think they were all upon the boat speaking many different languages to each other. So they were all speaking one language on the boat. They got a covenant in one language. And they came off the boat with one language. And somehow it seems that they were living many places. Somehow between chapter 9 and chapter 11, and they come together at this one spot and say, look, we don't want to be scattered and whatever, but they had one language. Now, I'm sure if you do any kind of research there and things outside of the Bible, and let's use the word Torah here to make it sound sweeter. If you're reading history outside of the Torah, the book of wisdom, you're going to find that people were living in many different places on the earth prior to Babel. So am I to then understand that they gathered together from different places and came together and said, let us travel together and go to one place and set up camp there and build our own place in one spot? Because, when you read different commentaries, they tell you they were trying to group together instead of dispersing like the Creator wanted, and that became their downfall. Because they shouldn't have been trying to stay together, they should spread out and so on, and, overflow the earth, stuff like that, spread out. So they had one language, and they came together and started journeying. But since history is telling us people were living everywhere, over the so-called Middle East, over in America, different parts of America, people are everywhere, they say. How is it that you can have one speech from people who were living in many, many places? You see, now I'm more inclined to think that chapter 10 is probably correct, because it shows many nations with different tongues. And what would happen when you are living in many places? You end up forming different languages and different words and so on, variants to your language. You leave your father's house, you stay there for 100, 200, 300 years, growing up your own family, start your own little society and so on. You're going to end up changing the language from your father's house or coming up with your own new language. Why? Because as you have new experiences and you create new things and so on, you form new words. Or you change words. So you start to sound different from your great-grandparents whose house you came out of. So if history is telling you that they were in many different places, how is it that the whole earth had only one language and one speech before dispersion and tongues corruption at Babel, when they were living in many places, speaking many things, because you can't live in many different places on the earth and have different languages like history is telling us people had? So somehow the timing is just not adding up for me, the dating and so on. No wonder people come up with all kinds of different dates, because everybody is trying to be right, but they're communicating in a strange kind of way that this is showing that something is wrong. This is showing that something is wrong. Then we're told now that there were different people groups at Sumer, with their small little, might I use the word kingdoms, so they had their own little kings and so on. And they came together. So you're telling me nobody in their own little people groups had different kinds of languages or different ways to say words? So from Sumer now, they came out to different parts of Africa, different parts of India, and they say India was a part of Africa in the early days. They're coming from different places, and then they're lodging there at Sumer. Then eventually they go and they start up Egypt. You're telling me in all of that, people didn't have different languages before they reached Sumer? Or the same language with different kinds of words? Different pronunciations of the same word then? Yet it says they were all of one tongue and one speech and so on. How is that possible? How can we reconcile that knowledge with Genesis 11 verse 1? And it's strange it tells you in verse 2 that they traveled from the east, as if they don't really want to tell you where these people come from. It's just from the east. And so anybody can tell you, well, it means India. Now somebody else is telling me yesterday that it's someplace else in Asia. Tibet or wherever they said. So in a strange story as we find in Genesis chapter 11, from the east should have made it clear in the text where the east was, so that nobody can argue with it. But it doesn't do that. But it clearly tells you in the land of Shinar, so they want you to think Babylon, Iraq. They want you to be sure of that, but they don't want you to know where the people came from in the east. Why? Is it because they're making something plain and clear to you? Or is the removal of time, the changing of dates, the confusion of the dating, the lack of sufficient information about the identity of the people tied into the place where the people came from, so they don't want to tell you where they came from. They will just tell you where they're going. They're going to Shinar. So that you can have a lot more history after Genesis 11 in the rest of the scriptures as the Torah builds up. But you're not quite sure where the base was or where the starting point was. Just like you don't even know where the starting point was with Adam, because you're still wondering today if this or that or the other 5,000 people are correct when they say this is where Eden was. So your knowledge of the base things is shrouded in a mystery, and you are sure about the original language. You're not sure where the people came from, but you're sure about the language they spoke. You're not sure where Eden was. You're not sure what Adam sounded like, but you're sure of his language. The article goes on to say, it is believed that the Sumerians are related to the people living between the Black and Caspian Seas. So now, if the people are related to those other people from the Black and Caspian Seas, then they could just be like some relative of the people, or people who were of a different, let's say here, nation, but had lived like the other people or lived close to them, such that they shared, similar lifestyles, culture, and so on. One learning from the other, things like that, and blended together so well after a certain amount of time had passed. which means more time that is not explained properly in the Torah. But that's because the Torah doesn't really want you to know all the details. It just wants you to believe and have faith. And then he will turn on and say you have knowledge when you really just believed it, because none of us was there to see it happen. But God wrote this. Well, is it unfair of me to say, before I accept this Torah in all its words as complete truth, like no one has ever tampered with it, twisted it, done anything to it, is it unfair of me to desire that the Most High strike a rock and carve some stuff in front of my face so I can see what he wrote and have some instructions from him for myself? Is that too much to ask? In a world where I cannot be sure, in a world where there is mainstream religious deception the world over, and anyone who seems to be standing up strong with some kind of ancient knowledge about the Creator or about ancient people, those people are hidden away or put away permanently? Is that too hard? If instead of trying to verify the information from your commentary, that I ask if I can verify the information from the Creator himself by asking if he can just write on some stones for me? That way I'm just sure. Because when I see it happen in front of my eyes, I don't have to wonder anymore. Because if the stones appear in my house, before my eyes, being lit up with fire, striking lightning or whatever, writing on it, and I'm the only one in the house, and there I have my own Torah. You know, that's laughable. But the concept expressed in that is not so far gone. You know why? Because we can find such a similar expression in Jeremiah chapter 31, in verse 33, but this shall be the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel. After those days, saith the Most High, I will put my law in their inward parts and write it in their hearts, and will be their power, and they shall be my people. Somehow seeming to suggest that some future writing is necessary because past or current writing is insufficient. You can't go to any church or camp without people arguing and fighting with you. I'm not going to do that. The Bible doesn't say that. It says it right here. Well, I don't believe that's what it means. So it looks like this time he's going to write it in everybody's heart. Whatever that writing means, he's going to put it in you in a way where nobody can convince you otherwise by telling you God said this instead of that. So the article continues, at approximately the same time the Sumerians appeared in Mesopotamia, another civilization emerges in the south, the Egyptians. But before that, it is said that these Sumerians were speaking a non-Semitic language. But gee, I thought the Sumerians were speaking the only and original Semitic language, because it was the Lashawan Kadash, or the original tongue Adam spake, whether it was Hebrew or Aramaic or socks and shoes. Because they had it at Sumer up until the curse happened at Babel. So if Sumerians at Shinar were speaking a non-Semitic language, these people linked to the people who came off the boat who got a covenant, all of them, not just Noah, but Noah and all three sons. If these people are speaking the original tongue in Genesis 11 verse 1, which was the tongue of the earth of one speech, then are we to understand that this people were speaking, Shemitic people were speaking a non-Semitic language as the original language of earth? Hello. And then, if at about the same time the Sumerians appeared in Mesopotamia, another civilization comes up in the south, the Egyptians, Then it goes on to say the original language of the Egyptians is Hamitic. So then the original language of the Hamites would be a non-Semitic language. But what's the problem we have with that? Because if we got Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and if Egyptians are of Ham, then it makes sense that they are speaking a Hamitic tongue, not a Shemitic tongue. But what is the problem with that? As also Japheth would be speaking some language that is not Shemitic either. But how in the world can this be? I mean, you're telling me no significant amount of time had passed, which shows that 10 and 11 should be switched around? Because how can Ham be speaking a non-Semitic language when the Sumerians are also speaking a non-Semitic language? When the Sumerians are the people speaking the language of the earth, which is the original tongue. So then that would mean the Sumerians are speaking a Shemitic tongue, because the original language would end up being a Shemitic tongue, even though there were no Shemites in the time of Adam. So why does the Shemitic tongue matter more? Shouldn't it more be an Adamic tongue that carries a swing instead of a Shemitic tongue? Because before there was a Shemitic tongue, there would have been an Adamic tongue. So if Ham is speaking a Hamitic tongue, and now that we have learned that the Sumerians started the Egyptians, then that means that if the Sumerians are speaking the language of the earth, which you thought was a Shemitic tongue, then the Hamite should be now speaking a Semitic tongue as well, because the Egyptian empire was started up by the Sumerians. So if Sumerians are supposed to have a Shemitic tongue because they had the one original language and they journeyed from the east with that language, then they should be speaking a Shemitic tongue, yet we're told that they were speaking a non-Semitic tongue. So which is it? Does the Sumerians speak Shemitic or non-Shemitic? And did they start Egypt as a Semitic speaking empire? Or was Egypt first a Semitic empire of Shem? And something happened that turned Egypt upside down and it changed its tongue. Was Egypt overturned earlier than we think? The more I read, the more I'm thinking that there is something, well, with my very small knowledge of things Egyptian, the more I'm thinking that there was something greater about Egypt that is not expressed in the Bible. Really. But obviously that greatness would have come from the Sumerians, from what I've been reading. But if the Sumerians started the Egyptian life, the Egyptian empire, Egyptian culture, then Egyptian culture may or should reflect Sumerian culture and lifestyle. And if the Sumerians were a power people, journeying from the east makes you think that they were the people the Most High was dealing with, then shouldn't they have had a Shemitic language? Well then, why are the Sumerians speaking a non-Semitic language when they all came off the boat speaking the same language in the ark with Noah? So then, you trace it backwards, Noah speaking a non-Semitic language? So obviously, some information is jumbled up to us as we move around studying these things on the earth. One person comes and they prove to you the language was Hebrew. Another person comes and they prove to you it was Latin. Or it was this, or it was that, it was Aramaic. Now, the rest of the article is nice. I'm just going to read a small amount more of it, not all of it. During the time of the Sumerians and the Egyptians, the Semitic peoples lived in Sumeria and traveled west into the land of Canaan. And you know, whenever you deal with the land of Canaan in the scriptures, you're dealing with the place where the Most High had his people and so on. So, alright. So, the Semitic peoples lived in Sumeria. So, is that saying that the Sumerians were Semitic peoples? But then earlier on, the article is saying that the Semitic people in Sumeria were speaking a non-Semitic language. But anyway, they went west to Canaan. The descendants of Noah. It would appear that after the Tower of Babel, the descendants of Japheth traveled north with their language. So now it's starting to make you understand how Genesis chapter 10 happened with the different languages. The descendants of Ham traveled southwest with their language, and the Semites traveled west with their language. That is why it is called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. As I just read to you, the others went their different directions. The Shemites traveled west. So if they ended up at a certain point going west into the land of Canaan, and now you have Abraham eventually traveling to get to Canaan, and they're like Abraham the Hebrew. Well, I mean, it's kind of funny because these Hamites are in Canaan. So you're talking Egyptian territory now. And they sort of, kind of welcome him or so, whatever you want to call it, saying Abraham the Hebrew. And they say, see, it's Hebrew was the language that Abraham is speaking. It's because it's Hebrew that the forefathers before him were speaking, and all the way back to Adam. That doesn't sit well with me anymore. But they went west to Canaan, the Shemitic people. So they went there. Let's assume that they went there with their Hebrew language. If Canaanites are already in the land of Canaan, welcoming him with some Hebrew term, and he's still speaking to them with his Hebrew, all right? You're going to tell me that he used lingua franca, like probably Aramaic. And I covered that already in one lesson before, months ago. How come as soon as he shows up, he knows how to speak to them? He's new to the area, and already he can communicate. It doesn't take him any time to learn this, and it doesn't take them any time to figure out how to communicate with him as well. You see, I already said that people can go anywhere in the Bible and just communicate with anyone else for the most part. And so we usually think, because we were told to say that it was a lingua franca they were using, like in this case, probably Aramaic. Why instead did the story not show that it took them a while, like many years or something like that? Well, it probably wouldn't be many years, not that long, but it took them a while. It sounds like they just welcomed him right away, and they could both communicate, him and the Hamites. Why would Abraham, immediately upon getting there, be able to use Aramaic as a lingua franca to speak with these people?